of us have asked our spouses? How many of us have asked our spouses for something, and time has elapsed? A year goes by, 5 years go by, 10 years go by, and it reaches a point when our wives say to us, and in the case of the wives, the husbands say to them, it reaches a point when our wives say to us, "Don't ask me anymore, you already know the answer." At that moment, you know that if you continue to ask, you're going to be in trouble. So I've learned. I've learned to stop asking her, but I never stop asking him. You weren't ready for that one. So we've learned not to ask anymore. When God visits Abraham in chapter 15 and says, "This young man from Damascus, as faithful as he's been, as good as he's been to you, he will not inherit you. But one from your own body will inherit you." At the moment when he talks to his wife, how many years had they been married? How many years had they been trying to have a child? I'm going to guess. No less than 40 years. 40. And they tried so much that now the hope of fathering a child now becomes a burden. To the point that when something becomes a burden, in the case of Sarah, she gives up hope and she says, "How dare you ask of me that again? You know where we've been. We've been down this road before. We tried for 40 years. But I have an idea. I have a younger servant. You can father a child to her." Again, I've discussed this. That it was legal and it was ethical at that time. She said, "Through her, I can give you a family." Because a servant was not considered a person. It was considered a thing. So she was disposing her what? The human possibility of fixing and bringing the promise to reality, as long as there are resources accessible to me. Accessible to Sarah. So Sarah digged deep into her pocket. She said, "I have a resource. I have a young woman who's going to bring forth the promise." And Abraham admits and he concedes to do the job. And Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. Genesis 62 says, "So she said to Abraham, 'The Lord has kept me from having children.'" Again, it's God's responsibility, according to Sarah, that she hasn't been able to have any children. "So go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And Abraham agreed to what Sarai said. But then, Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. Ishmael is born. Now Ishmael is the son of Abraham. 1 year goes by. 2 years go by. 3 years go by. 10 years go by. Now Ishmael is ready to become a man. Ishmael becomes 13 years of age. He's a teenager now. For 13 years, Abraham has been pouring out his fatherhood. God's word, listen to this. God's word, the fatherhood promise, into a teenager. Because Ishmael represented the promise. Through what? Through the factor of human possibility. For 13 years, Abraham had been dedicated to his ministry as a father for 13 years. Imagine that. 13 years involved with his own son. It wasn't his half-son. It was his own son. Church, 13 years. How much have you and I poured out to our children, regardless how old or how young they are? We love them. We want them to do things right. We want them to get close to God. We say God has a special ministry and calling for their lives. But imagine at 13 years, all of a sudden, God shows up. 13 years later, God shows up and says, knocks on the door and says, "Abraham, How you doing, buddy? God, we're on our way. Look at him. He looks like me. I've been doing my job well. You know, I'm just using my imagination here. Please don't look at this at the Bible, because you're not going to find it. But if Abraham was a father like many of us are here, and we're proud of our boys and girls, I don't imagine Abraham being any different. Especially if he had received a word from God that he was going to father many nations. Especially if he had received a promise from God that he will not go to the grave without being a father. I bet Abraham was really proud. How do I know that? Because he says to God, if only Ishmael could live in your presence. Abraham had put his hopes into his son Ishmael. And his desire was that Ishmael would live in God's presence. Verse 18, and Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. But what does God do 13 years later? God shows up and says, I need to hit the reset button. Yes, sir. Because everything you've been doing for 13 years is not what I meant. Many of us have been doing things for so many years that God needs to hit the reset button in our lives. And I can imagine Abraham said, what? What do you mean? Look at him. If only he can live under your blessing. I've done most of the job, God. Where have you been in 13 years? Hello? I've taken him out to the field. I have trained him. I have shown him what it is to fear God. He knows the language. He has his heart. He has the heart in the right place. But God said, I need to hit the reset button, Abraham. And what did Abraham do? He laughed. He said, you gotta be kidding me. Really? No, but look at him. God, it's unnecessary. The job is already done. The person's already here before you and me. And what does God do? He said, because you laughed, I'm going to name the boy for you. And God named him Isaac because Abraham laughed. Not necessarily because Sarah had laughed. But the one who laughed first was who? Was Abraham. You see? You're too quiet. Come on, church. When you and I find humor in what God says and wants to do, He finds a new name. What you and I call unnecessary, when you and I have been building our ministries for 13 years or however long you've been building your ministry, or however hard you've been working on what you think it ought to be done, and ought to be in what God has for you in your life, watch out. Because God may show up with a new name. God may show up with something new in your life. But if we are so embedded, if we are so busy, if we are so focused, no, I want to do this. I want my son to be this. I want my daughter to be that. Or I want us to go here and there. You and I are going to spin our wheels. And God may very well show up later and say, I never told you to do that. Ishmael is set aside, just as Moses' prior attempt to help his people proved to be a failure. 13 years of ministry in the life of Abraham proved to be irrelevant for what God was intending to do with this man and his wife. It's a good moment to ask ourselves, is what we have in our minds, is what we're doing today, is still relevant to what God envisions through us and for us? Humanly speaking, that by Abraham going to Hagar, humanly speaking, it would prove that Abraham would provide for the paternity requirements for the promise. But we now know that fulfilling the paternity requirements for the promise is not enough, or is not just necessarily what God is looking for in someone. To me, this was a breakthrough moment. Why? Because when Abraham laughs, maybe God and the Father and the Son and whoever was there with him, they look at each other. Did we just say a joke? What was funny about what we said? This man's laughing. Sometimes I say something serious and my family bursts out in laughter. And I said, okay, tell me the joke because I missed it. And they tell me, then I laugh. Sometimes God tells us something. That the laughter, the first laughter, which is a laughter that says is unnecessary. That laughter, that not mocking, but it's a laughter like saying, you gotta be kidding me, I don't believe this. What about everything I've done all these years? That first laughter of doubt, that laughter that represents what doesn't seem to be needed anymore, God converts it into a laughter of joy. Amen. After the promise is born. Amen. The birth of a son, Isaac, through Sarah is not only impossible because this woman is 80, but it's also necessary because Ishmael is already there. Watch out for God doing something new. When you and I think that it's impossible and unnecessary, that are two very essential elements to God doing something new in someone's life.